Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're going back to our old friends at Extra History. It is the most reacted to channel on this channel, and for good reason. I love the way they tell a good story. I love some of the stories they choose to tell, which aren't always ones that other people are telling, and this is one of those in particular. Obviously, we have seen stories told about the Tuskegee Airmen in movies and in different platforms, things like that. But there's not a lot of YouTube channels that are doing that. So I'm excited to dive into this one to learn a little bit more myself about these men who were pioneers in many ways for the African American community, especially at a time when the U.S. military was still segregated during World War II. So I'll put the link down in the description. You can check out the content without my commentary, as well as all the other stuff that Extra History has to offer. This one came out just a couple of months ago. It is not their most recent video. Some of you were probably hoping to see me take a look at their Shot Heard Around the World, but we've done a lot of American Revolution stuff lately. I thought this would be a little different. Let's dive in.
Italian Theater, July 2nd, 1943. High above the countryside, Second Lieutenant Charles B. Hall steadies his P-40 Warhawk alongside a group of B-25 bombers. He and his squadron are flying escort, ensuring the big bombers aren't stung before they unleash their payloads or shot down before they can come home. Suddenly, a glint to his left. German fighters closing in high. He banks and dives away from the formation. As he thought, the German pilot in his Focke-Wulf FW190 doesn't chase. He's locked in on the American B-25, lining up a shot on the bomber and the 10 men inside.
Obviously, we have heard a lot of these stories lately with Apple TV releasing Masters of the Air, and they actually focus briefly on the Tuskegee Airmen flying in Italy and escorting these bombers. But there's a lot of discipline required here. Your job as one of these fighter pilots escorting these B-25s is to protect those bombers so they can make their target runs. And obviously the FW-190s, their job is to ignore those fighters and go for the bombers. That is what everything is focused on. And it takes discipline to do that, because if you try to be a hero in this situation, instead of doing your job and staying in formation and doing everything right, it's bad for everybody.
It's a fatal mistake for the German, as Lieutenant Hall isn't running. He jams his foot pedals and yanks the stick, swerving back and around, the German sliding through his crosshairs. He jams the button. Tracers whicker in dancing streams toward the enemy. The German fighter bleeds white smoke, then drops, spiraling down toward the Italian countryside in an unrecoverable spin. It's the first aerial victory for Lieutenant Hall, for his unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and for the legendary Tuskegee Airmen.
And I love that he says aerial victory there. People often call it kills, and that's not technically correct. It's a victory. It's not about killing the pilot or killing anybody. It's about bringing down the plane, and that's a victory.
This historical close shave is brought to you by Henson Shaving, who we thank very much for supporting this episode on important American history. No matter where they lived in the 1940s, Black Americans experienced racism that limited their lives, goals, and expectations. So in order for an elite squadron of African American fighter pilots to go soaring heroically into the air, you can imagine that some pertinent events needed to take place on the ground first.
I love that, because we so often focus on the story, which is black pilots in the air, you know, achieving things for themselves, but their whole lives prepared them for those moments. You know, everything happens to lead us to the place that we get. I didn't end up with a YouTube channel with nearly 500,000 subscribers because one day I decided to have a YouTube channel. It happened, and it grew to the point that it has because of my entire life up to that point. The things that I was doing at 8, 9, 10 years old, and when I was reading the almanac and walking from monument to monument at the Battle of Gettysburg, making notes and consuming every book I could get my hands on at the library about the Civil War and the Titanic and about presidents. And it was about my grandparents taking me to battlefields, and it was about having amazing teachers in high school and the professors in college that poured into me. And all of those things got me to this place, and a lifetime of being a public speaker that allowed me to be able to communicate with an audience.
It starts with the Great Depression and the failing of the Herbert Hoover White House. Without that, the U.S. probably wouldn't have elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a landslide. Now, while the Great Depression was a catalyst for sure, FDR's win was also partially attributed to his ability to court African-American voters. Up until that point, blacks seldomly parted with the Republicans,
right,
still considered by many to be the party of Lincoln. Yet, voters who cared about the country's civil rights progress at the time had begun to feel disillusioned after years of voting Republican resulted in little change.
Yeah, and this is important as a kind of a political aside. Don't vote for somebody just because that's who your parents voted for and just because that's who you've always voted for. I've had these conversations with people in my life where I've been like, well, who do you support? And they'll tell me, well, I support this particular party because that's what people in my area of life, that's what we do. And I'm like, well, but what about this issue and this issue and this issue? And when I start pointing the issues out to them, they're like, well, wait a second. I don't really agree with that party on any of those issues. But they had always been told that's who you voted for. Vote your conscience and vote for the people that make the most sense now, not the people who made the most sense for you 30 years ago.
And while he initially resisted the urge to get involved in the German conflict, FDR knew that he had to prepare the nation. So he created the CPT, or Civilian Pilot Training Program, in 1939. These aviation training programs were at universities all over the country, and many white Americans were able to sign up.
This is such intelligent stuff to do. Roosevelt, like many world leaders, could see the war coming. And by 1939, obviously, the war had come. But the American public weren't in a place where they were willing to get involved. But Roosevelt, in his wisdom, saw that we needed to be prepared anyway. And especially after World War I, when we jumped in and we really were not prepared at all to be in a major world war. This time, a lot of the groundwork that needed to be laid in order to prepare us for that place was stuff like this, and instituting the draft even before we got into the war, stuff like that.
Years later, Frederick Patterson, the president of the Tuskegee Institute, a college for African Americans, lobbied the War Department to authorize the creation of segregated training facilities for blacks at its airfields. Then, under pressure from FDR, the War Department agreed. And it's there where these black men began their journey towards becoming aviation legends. In 1941, they received a vote of confidence from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who showed up one day to watch African-American pilots training in their Piper J-3 Cubs. After, she insisted on meeting the Civilian Pilot Training Program's instructor, C. Alfred Chief Anderson, and after an exchange of pleasantries, asked him for a favor. "I want you to take me up." Despite protests from the Secret Service, she climbed aboard. And
think about what a big deal this is. The First Lady of the United States getting in a plane with an African-American pilot. Like, think about the message that sends. And I give her a ton of credit because she knew what the optics were of this.
Chief? Well, he wasn't going to refuse the First Lady. They took off and whipped around the Alabama sunshine for around half an hour. And afterwards, she sang the chief's praises in the press.
Love
a
it.
Public vote of confidence in the Tuskegee pilot's skill. Later that year, the Empire of Japan launched its infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, which you can learn more about in our Path to Pearl Harbor series. Then Germany and Italy declared war on the United States 4 days later. With a two-front war now firmly seated in his lap, FDR started exploring strategies to handle a global combat theater. Outrage over Pearl Harbor prompted huge numbers of Americans to enlist. And though both the American government and society had failed the black and brown men who'd returned from World War I, see our Harlem Hellfighters episode.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, he's absolutely right about the Harlem Hellfighters, which we've covered those videos as well. Harlem Hellfighters, in my mind, the best American troops on the Western Front in World War I. Took more... we've talked about all of that. But in their mind, they had done enough, and they were right. they had done enough to prove that they deserved equality when they came home, and they didn't get it.
For a little on that, African American men once again signed up in hopes of earning respect, recognition, and to serve their country. Black men came to Tuskegee from all over the country, which, given it was in Alabama, was daunting in and of itself. Many who came from the northern states were unused to the naked racism of the Jim Crow South, as opposed to the more veiled type they'd experienced in New York or Chicago.
Yeah, and speaking of Harlem Hellfighters, initially they actually trained in the South, and it was just a nightmare. It's a catch-22 because the majority of the black population still lived in the South, and so it made sense for things like the Tuskegee Institute to be there, but it also meant that you were directly in contact with the most segregationist and the most racist people that there were.
This was particularly true since in Alabama, lynching was still a regular occurrence during the war and would remain so after it. In fact, many of these young black men found themselves derided en route to Tuskegee. Yet still, they came, eager to prove that they could do the work. Some had previous flying experience, while others were just smart and talented with dreams of flight. But most knew that it wouldn't be enough to be good. They would have to excel beyond expectations, because much of the military and public expected them to fail.
This is always the challenge, right? When you are... It's why we tell these stories, and it's why stories like the 54th Massachusetts in the American Civil War, or the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I, or the Tuskegee Airmen in World War II, it's why these stories get told and are such an inspiration, is because all other things being equal, they would have the same opportunities as others. But not only are they starting from a place where they're already challenged just to get that same opportunity, but then if they did just as well as the white pilots, that wouldn't be enough. They've actually got to start from down here and end up here just in order to prove themselves.
You see, the narrative back then was that blacks were inferior and weren't smart or mentally quick enough for complex work like aviation. In fact, many white officers, including some of the ones assigned to Tuskegee, didn't believe in the program or the recruits at all. Still, others saw the program as nothing more than a means to wash the blacks out of the military air service and shut them and their supporters up once and for all about wanting to earn wings. Many of those officers quickly trained black officers to take their positions so they could be relieved of the assignment and move on. This turned out, though,
actually, okay, fine,
to actually be a good thing,
since
it brought Benjamin O. Davis Jr. to command. Davis was a West Point graduate who had endured the silent treatment from his fellow cadets most of his time there. Instead of cracking his resolve, the isolation left him more determined. He was possessed with the desire to fly, but like many black men since the First World War, he'd been rejected by the U.S. Army Air Corps because of his race. However, thanks to the establishment of the civilian pilot training program at Tuskegee, he finally had the means of achieving his goal. In fact, he'd already been assigned to teach military tactics at Tuskegee because even though he'd graduated 35th in a class of over 200, the Army didn't want...
Which is, you're talking about West Point. That's impressive as heck to finish that high.
...want him commanding white soldiers. Davis started training as an aviation cadet in the summer of 1941, part of the Institute's first class. And in less than 2 years' time, he was promoted to lieutenant commander of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the U.S. military's first all-black fighter pilot squadron. And
lieutenant commander's a naval rank. I want to look that up because I'm wondering if maybe that's just a slight mistake there. Okay, yeah, so he was a lieutenant colonel. A couple of things about this, too. First of all, Benjamin Davis from Northeast Ohio. Just got to point that out. We got to highlight our guys. He's from Cleveland, graduated from high school in Cleveland, and was the first black man to graduate from West Point in 47 years. From 1889 until he graduated in 1936. No black graduate. So that in and of itself made him kind of a pioneer.
That combat designation was a huge deal because in much of the U.S. military, black men only filled support roles and were not provided weapons training, even on things like naval deck guns. The Army, it would seem, wanted black men driving trucks and loading cargo and not engaging the enemy. And unfortunately, Davis witnessed that play out. He saw white instructors of the 99th subject cadets to extra scrutiny, redundant testing, and in some cases being washed out for no valid reason.
And this is what I'm talking about, how you're already starting at a disadvantage and you actually have to do more than is expected of the average white soldier in your same situation.
Often, Tuskegee trainees would be held up for as long as 14 months, when pilots from other programs would be in the air in less than 3.
And what's the result of this? You're obviously going to have better pilots because these men had to work harder, they had to be better, and they had to train longer.
Yet the pace of the war and attrition rate among U.S. pilots meant that the holdup in the 99th made no sense. In fact, it was so bad that Commander Noel Parrish, one of the few white officers who treated cadets the same regardless of race, who believed in and supported the 99th, went to the War Department and called them out for dragging their feet. Parrish's only requirement was insisting the unit's training be top-notch. Finally, of sheer necessity, in 1943, the men of the 99th were deployed to Morocco. There, they joined Operation Corkscrew, a joint effort by the Allies to liberate the Axis-occupied island of Pantelleria, which was deemed essential to the upcoming invasion of Sicily.
Yeah.
And this was where, escorting B-25 bombers, Lieutenant Hall scored the unit's first air victory that we showed you in our intro. When news got out that a Tuskegee Airman had shot down a German fighter, that
That's
down
awesome.
plane was not the only thing smoking.
Yep.
The African-American press was on fire for Second Lieutenant Hall, who, as the first African-American to shoot down an enemy plane, was also the first to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. He also received a personal congratulations from General Eisenhower and several other high-ranking officers. Now, while the official recognition was nice, the airmen's day-to-day treatment, not so much. As successful as the unit was, they still lived in a tumble-down barracks and flew P-40 Warhawks handed down from another squadron.
So here we go again, where you're taking on Focke-Wulf's 190s with inferior American planes. I mean, inferior compared to what technology was available for the Americans. And just imagine what they can do if you would give them the same equipment that you were giving everybody else.
Planes that weren't nearly as fast as the German aircraft they faced. In fact, it speaks to the skill of the 99th that they were still able to hold their own in the air. And of course, racial tensions on the ground remained. In fact, the 99th often saw their white counterparts smoking and joking with German POWs, meanwhile ignoring or insulting black flyers and ground crews. Amenities like officers' lounges and other recreational facilities were whites only, and shortly after Hall's first air victory, a group of bigoted senior officers lobbied Army Chief of Staff George Marshall to shut down the, quote, experiment of the 99th. To support their case, they submitted a 1925 Army War College report full of dubious data and stereotypes, which insisted black soldiers were too cowardly and simple-minded for anything other than manual labor.
I don't know. The only thing I see cowardly and simple-minded here is the bigotry of these guys who are so filled with hate that they can't see that they've got some really good pilots on their hands.
This all happened just as Benjamin O. Chief Davis was being promoted to colonel and preparing to take charge of the 332nd Fighter Group, a new, larger unit of fresh Tuskegee pilots. But when he heard that the 99th was in danger of being disbanded for incompetence, Davis had enough. He held a press conference at the Pentagon, sticking up for his unit.
Good for him. I'd be pissed too.
And he appeared before a War Department committee to plead his case. Davis argued that the 99th, unlike white units, had no experienced veterans to guide them, and were operating slower, less maneuverable aircraft than the enemy, yet they still managed to hold their own while flying against the best fighters in the Luftwaffe. Furthermore, they were flying more missions than their white counterparts. Davis's defense prompted an official inquiry that resulted in exactly the opposite of what the racists wanted. Not only did the committee find that the 99th was fighting as well as any of the white units, but during the investigation, the squadron shot down 12 more fighters over a 2-day period in January of 1944.
I absolutely love this. It's like the biggest middle finger to those racists you could possibly come up with.
Once that nonsense was settled, the newly formed 332nd was deployed to an airfield in Italy, where they would transition from their old P-40s to newer P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. which they decided to distinguish
The red
by
tails.
painting the tails of the planes red. Thus, the codename Red Tails was born, though another nickname, the Red Tail Angels, was soon to come. As the war progressed, the U.S. began taking heavy casualties as German fighters picked off their high-payload B-17 and B-24 bombers. A particularly bad situation, since the loss of each bomber also meant the loss of 10 highly trained crewmen. So, escort fighters were in high demand, and the Red Tails rose to the challenge. Their strategy, originated by Davis, was simple but strict. The job of escort flights was to escort only. The Red Tails were never to chase German fighters if they retreated, since this was a known strategy to draw away the fighter screen. The strategy worked, and the Red Tails chalked up thousands of flight miles of successful missions.
This is where I talked at the beginning about that discipline to hold your position and to do your job and not to go chasing after glory.
They also engaged and destroyed a variety of ground targets. In fact, they were so effective that a reporter mistakenly started rumors that the Red Tails never lost a bomber during escort missions. This was untrue. They lost 27 bombers, but those numbers fell well below the average loss rate of 46 among other squadrons. And the Red Tails became so well known for their excellence in flying escort missions that bomber squadrons specifically requested the unit. This became so prevalent that Davis painted the phrase, "by request," just below his cockpit canopy. His nose art simply had two words, Tuskegee Airmen.
I love it so much.
Of course, there was always speculation that the bomber crews might not have known their escorts were black. Some of that speculation actually comes from oral histories with the pilots, who often said it with a chuckle. The 332nd would fly its longest mission of the war on March 24, 1945, escorting a bomber flight to Berlin, where they were attacked by a group of 30 Me-262s, the
Jets.
first jet fighter. Not only did the Red Tails engage and break up the attack at long range, they bagged 3 jets, including 2 flown by German fighter aces. Originally, the Army had looked for the Tuskegee program to fail, trying to prove its stereotypes about black service members. But the opposite happened. Those men, along with their mechanics, ground crews, and nurses, served with unparalleled distinction and honor. And for a time, they achieved their goal of a double victory against fascism abroad and racism at home.
And so this is why we get movies about guys like the Red Tails, and this is why we get stories about the 54th Massachusetts. And for the love of God, would somebody make a movie about the Harlem Hellfighters, please? Anyway.
They proudly served and loved a country that didn't always love them back. And while 66 of them died, many lived to see the fruits of their labor when Harry Truman finally desegregated the U.S. military on July 26, 1948. They'd also see Benjamin O. Davis Jr. named the first black general in the U.S. Air Force, and witness other milestones.
Yeah, he ended up a 4-star general, was made a 4-star general by Bill Clinton in his later years after he had retired.
As younger African Americans and people from all walks of life drew from their example. It's a legacy that shouldn't be forgotten, and it should certainly never be erased, as some Defense Department articles have been around the time of this episode's airing. In February of 2025, an Air Force curriculum unit on the Tuskegee Airmen was discontinued due to the Trump administration's policies, but then quickly restored after a massive public outcry. And though these policies are atrocious, heck, we even have a series of shorts raising awareness of other examples of these deletions, it says a lot that the respect for the Tuskegee Airmen remains so high that the public would come to their defense nearly 80 years after their last
As we
combat
should.
mission. Because no matter how uncomfortable it may be at times, Black history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is every American's history.
100% agree with that. This is our story. These are our heroes. Black, white, Native American, Asian, whatever you are, these are our people.
It's your history, it's my history, and we need to know it. Because truly, anyone trying to obscure that is simply doing a disservice to us all.
I agree. That was a really good video. I loved being able to tell that story and learn a little more about the story. I loved having our Ohio connection in there. And let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.